So we're continuing to look at the book of Acts. Now, I think, as I've said to you before, you have to remember when you are speaking with normal people, they know very little about the Bible. So when you say something like, oh, something in the book of Acts, or you refer to Acts, it's very difficult for them to make any sense of that. Even I think many Christians probably don't really know why the book is called Acts. Well, of course, Acts is actions. And so it is either the continued acts or actions of Jesus Christ after his resurrection, as some like to refer to it, or it is the acts of the apostles. And so we've come to Acts chapter 5, and we're just going to look at a small group of verses here. And actually, in some way, this is a little bit more of a topical than an exegetical passage. So the book of Acts, about the actions of the apostles, is a historical narrative, the book. It's Luke's recording of what happened in the early church. So it's attributed to Luke. He identifies himself early on. He says that this is his second book he's going on. So he also is the author of the gospel that bears his name, the Gospel of Luke. So Luke and Acts, this is a recording of a historical narrative of the early church. So remember, whenever you're doing something like this, it's always selective, right? There's no way he could write down every single thing that happens, so he's selecting certain things to seemingly give us somewhat of an accurate history, although that's not the exact purpose of the book, but to give us a history of the early church. So in these verses here, we read something about what it was like in the early church. Now we're early in the book of Acts, and this is what we read. We'll see some development as we go through this book, but early on we see this. The apostles were performing many miraculous signs and wonders among the people. Now, usually in the book of Acts here, when it says the apostles, it's referring to Jesus' 12 disciples. Apostles literally means sent one. So there's a sense in which all Christians are apostles, small a, in the sense that we all have a calling, a commission from God to go and to make disciples. We are sent ones. Paul refers to himself as an apostle, right? So, but usually here when it says apostles, it's referring to the 12. Disciple literally means a learner. So sometimes they're referred to as Jesus' disciples, Jesus' followers, or Jesus' learners. And here they're referred to as the apostles. So the apostles were performing many miraculous signs and wonders among the people. And all the believers were meeting regularly at the temple in the area known as Solomon's Colonnade. But no one else dared to join them, even though all the people had high regard for them. Yet more and more people believed and were brought to the Lord, crowds of both men and women. So very different than Jesus' earthly ministry. Crowds would come to see Jesus and to hear Jesus. But as best we can tell, or at least what's indicative of, at the beginning of the book of Acts, we're told there were about 120 believers that included Jesus' 11 disciples. Judas, of course, committed suicide and is no longer there. He's replaced by Matthias, but it includes his disciples and his family and then some other believers. At this point, and Luke gives us some indication in the text, there's more than 5,000 believers. And as it says here, many are coming to believe in Jesus. So dramatic growth, or at least what we consider to be dramatic growth, I would think, here in New England, but also very different than when Jesus was on earth and ministering. Now there's suddenly this proliferation, right, of belief in him. A little bit longer. As a result of the apostles' work, sick people were brought out into the streets on beds and mats so that Peter's shadow might fall across some of them as he went by. Crowds came from the villages around Jerusalem, bringing their sick and those possessed by evil spirits, and they were all healed. One of my favorite words is compartmentalization, both because it's a long word. I thought, wow, if I was ever playing Scrabble, which I never do, I don't know if I ever have, maybe once, but wow, could you imagine if you got compartmentalization? How many points you'd get for that? Well, you can see as I highlight here, there's a base to the word compartment, right? So compartmentalization is where you put things into compartments. I guess technically, if you were going to clean out the garage today and put things in compartments, you could say, I'm compartmentalizing, right? But I'm using it here in terms of how we approach life. Now, I think a good example of compartmentalization, which we do kind of automatically, we learn, is when you watch a movie. So just the other day, I was watching an action movie. And in this action movie, there's a fight between the good guy and the bad guy. And in that fight, which goes on for maybe 3 or 5 minutes, they're being thrown off buildings and they're smashing each other with chairs and they're pushing each other through walls and it goes on. And then right after he beats the bad guy, he hops in a car and drives off and goes on with the adventure. Now, why is it that I can watch that and not think, well, that is completely ridiculous? Why wouldn't I be laughing and say, is this a comedy? Or, no, I'm very tense and it's an action movie because I've compartmentalized. You see, I know that when you step into the movie world, the normal laws that exist in the real world no longer apply. We know that. We compartmentalize. So we know that everything moves quicker. People don't get hurt like they normally do in real life. I rarely see somebody going to the bathroom or eating a meal and it's amazing how fast they can get from place to place. Remember the show 24? If you ever saw that, it's amazing how much Jack Bauer? How much he could get done in 24 hours. But see, we watch that, we compartmentalize. We step into a different world. I can remember, watching to see, but when we step out of that world, then we don't do that, right? So one of the illustrations I used when I was growing up, I used to watch, we used to watch The Three Stooges, if you ever saw that. That is so offensive on so many levels now, but when I was a kid, it wasn't. And Larry, Curly, and Moe, and Moe would take a saw and put it on Larry's head, and cut, and he would take a hammer and hit him in the head, and they would poke out their eyes and do all this stuff. Well, interesting, even as a very young child, it never occurred to me, it might occur to some children, but it never occurred to me to take a hammer and hit my sister in the head, or to grab my dad's saw and to try and saw somebody in the head. See, already I'm compartmentalizing. I learned that the world that I see on TV is different than the real world. Now, I mention all of this is because as Christians, we can very easily do this. And this is a problem when it comes to Christianity. So when we have a passage like we have here, we can compartmentalize. So we have the Bible world, and then we have the real world. And so when we come to church, we think about the world in certain ways. And when we read the Bible in our devotions or you listen to a sermon, you're in the Bible world, just as if you were watching a movie. We understand that things work differently in that world that we've entered into. When it comes to a movie, we like it because it's a form of escape for us. And it can be the same for Christianity. We like it when we go to church or we get with other Christians because it can be a form of escape from the real world. Now, for encouragement purposes and things like that, that's what fellowship should be. But when it becomes an escape mentally, or you live in two different worlds, that's a problem. So in this passage here, we have in the one world, miraculous signs and wonders. And then in the real world, we have technology and medicine. And we have people sick and dying. I find that often we don't want people to ruin this compartmentalization, which is, my specialty. And that's what we're going to do this morning. I'm going to ruin this compartmentalization by asking difficult questions. But, one example would be is if someone came to you, and we find it very difficult, we find it threatening, if someone came to you and said, "Are you a Christian?" "Oh, yes, I'm a Christian." "Do you believe the Bible?" "Yes, I believe the Bible, what the Bible says." "Oh. Do you believe that God caused this massive flood? Do you believe in the Noah and the flood?" "Yes, I believe that really happened." "Oh, so God caused a flood that drowned thousands of people at least, including women and children, innocent women and children. It's not a cute little story about bringing animals on an ark. It's a story about massive murder. You believe that?" "Whoa, I don't know. I never thought about it that way." "What about Jericho, where the walls come a-tumbling down? All those people are killed. What about that?" "Well, I don't know. I never thought about it that way. And I don't want to think about that. I don't know what to do with that." You see, I go to Sunday school, I go to church, I read my Bible, and I'm in that world, and I don't think about that world the way I think about the real world. I compartmentalize. So crowds came from the villages around Jerusalem, bringing their sick and those possessed by evil spirits, and they were all healed. So, do you believe that really happened? You profess to be a Christian? Let me ask you this. Have you experienced God's miraculous healing? You personally, that God has miraculously healed you? Or have you been associated with somebody who was miraculously healed? Have you prayed for somebody who was miraculously healed? Have you ever read an account of somebody outside the Bible who was miraculously healed? Now, what happened here is not unusual. It really was, right, Jesus' apostles carrying on the earthly ministry that Jesus did. For example, here we read in Matthew that Jesus went throughout Galilee proclaiming the good news and healing every disease and sickness among the people. All who were ill, he healed them. All and every. So let's ask another question. So why don't we, I'm going to presume here, why don't we see miraculously healing commonly today as it appears that it happened in Jesus' earthly ministry and early in the book of Acts? Why isn't as common? So when I asked you the question, have you experienced God's miraculous healing? I suspect, some would say, no, I haven't. Some would say, yes, I have. Maybe because they were miraculously healed, or they prayed for somebody who was miraculously healed. They had a friend, a relative who was miraculously healed. Maybe they went to a healing service. But in all of those situations, I'd say, but it was rare. Even if it happened, it was rare. Even if you went to a healing service with somebody, let's say like Benny Hinn, as somebody told me, well, I'm not really familiar with the guy, but he's a healer, and somebody was telling me how they went to a healing service with him. Well, was everybody healed? Or were a few people in the service healed? Well, here, it's not just a few, it's all and everyone. And why doesn't Benny Hinn go over to a hospital and just walk through the rooms and just heal everybody miraculously? Why wouldn't God do that? If it's possible for God to do that, do you think it would be good if he did that? Why wouldn't he do that? Why don't we see miraculously healing like we see in Acts chapter 5? Verses 12 through 16. Well, that's a good question. Let me give you some answers to that question. Or at least what some people have said, and just talk through them. The first one is, this was an unusual time. God was working in an unusual way. Now, if you want a theological word for this, or a big word for this is called dispensationalism. Dispensations. So people who hold to this would say, and I think rightly so, I think we could all understand this, that it appears, now there's nothing in the Bible that says this, but that it appears that God works in different ways with his people at different times. He works in different ways. So the way God related to and worked with Abraham was different than the way he worked with Moses and the Israelites. He didn't give Abraham 10 commandments or anything, but he did do that with Moses and the Israelites. And then the way he seemed to work with the prophets and the judges with his people, that seemed to be a different way that God worked. And then, there's this intertestamental period, between, what is the distance between the time between the last book of the Old Testament and the first book of the New Testament? In other words, between the last prophet and the time of Jesus. They call it the intertestamental period. That's about 300 years. 300 years. When God seems to have been silent in that period. Then he works through Jesus. Then we see the early church. So it appears, and I think reasonably so, that God works in different ways at different times, different dispensations. And so we're in a different time. God did work. He actually worked lots of miracles during Jesus' earthly ministry and in the early church, but he's not doing that now. He's working a different way. Now, the second twist on that is that some go beyond and just say that by just looking at what's happening, that's what it seems like. And they say, no, the Bible specifies. And what the Bible has told us, or what God has told us in the Bible, is he is not doing miracles anymore. The big word for this is cessationist, to cease. God has ceased working this way. And so there's some big names. I mean, I've heard like John MacArthur talk about this. And point to the book of 1 Corinthians. These two shall pass away. I heard a message by him. These two shall pass away. This is the biblical basis that God is no longer working in these miraculous ways. And if you talk to me about holy laughter or speaking in tongues, those are false. Those are demonic. Because the cessationist would say, God has said, I am not going to do that anymore. And so if it's happening somewhere, it's counterfeit. It's false. So they've gone beyond just observation of the dispensationalist. Now they say, no, the Bible actually said, God said, I'm not going to do those things anymore. So I think we would say, at least, saying God can't is a little bit too strong. You might say God won't, decided not to, but can't. I think that's a little strong. God can always do whatever he wants, right? So, but that's one possible response here, is to say, God has just chosen not to work that way anymore. I don't know why, but that's what it seems like to us. It's not broadly happening. Oh, maybe there are some pockets, as some say, I read in Christianity Today, or I saw on the internet, God is doing great things or whatever, but they're at best small pockets. It's not broad-based, Billy Graham never was doing miraculous, healing people, or a lot of other well-known Christians and such, so it's not broadly happening. Okay, another possible response is that we lack the faith to get the miracles. And that this is also, I've heard this talked about a lot, that the problem is we have lost faith in God. If we would just have faith, the Spirit would come in power, and we would be seeing the signs and miracles that they saw in the early church. We would see those happening today, but we don't have the faith. On an individual level, it's worked out by, Andrew has experienced this, and somebody with any chronic disease who's a Christian, I'm sure, has had another Christian come to them or something and say, brother, if you just had enough faith, Andrew, you'd get up out of that chair. God wants all people to be healed. And the only limitation is your faith. So if you're still in that chair, Andrew, it's because you don't have enough faith. It's not God's problem. Now, Jesus, surprisingly, at least to me, said he was limited by a lack of faith. So when it came to his own hometown, he said, I can't do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. It does seem there, the limitation to God doing miracles is a matter of faith, a lack of faith. And of course, Jesus commended people for their faith, like the centurion, remember, who had the sick servant, and he goes to Jesus and said, will you come and heal my servant? And Jesus said, okay, I'll go and heal your servant with you. And he says to Jesus, oh, no, you're too important for that. All you have to do is say the word, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus said, my, what great faith you have. I've not seen that kind of faith in any of the Jews. And of course, he was healed. His servant was healed. Great faith. One more, Jesus seemed to endorse faith that can move mountains, right? He said to his disciples, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you'll be able to say to this mountain, go into the sea, and it will be cast into the sea. So there again, it seems that miraculous things can happen to the degree to which you have faith. So I want to bring that side out to you. I'm just trying to be honest and not only honest, but also very humble and sober about this. I have not seen God do miraculous things, miraculous healings and things. And it could be because of my lack of faith. I hope it isn't. I hope somehow I'm not deterring the work of God, holding back. Is it possible that my lack of faith could mean that somebody continues to suffer or dies? That it would be the cause because of my lack of faith? Could it be that God is not as glorified because of my lack of faith? And if I had more faith, I'd be doing great miracles and he would be glorified in them? I hope that's not the case. But I do have to ask you this. What does great faith look like? What does great faith look like? Now, for me, if you said, what does great faith look like? I mean, the first thing that occurs to me is great faith is faith that can claim things from God, that gets things from God miraculously. So, who is the example of this? For some of those of you who read biographies, I'm drawing a blank, Amy. Who had the orphanages? And George Mueller. If you've ever heard of George Mueller, you can Google him or whatever. He's often held up as what a tremendous man of prayer and faith. And because of his great faith, and there's story after story after story of miracles of God providing for this orphanage and for their needs and such, because of the great faith of George Mueller. So I could think of that, or I could think, well, great faith can claim miracles. Maybe it would be. If I had the faith, I could heal Andrew. But I just don't have that faith. But somebody with great faith could do that. But if I think a little bit more, I think of Hebrews chapter 11. Now, Hebrews chapter 11 is often referred to as the hall of faith. It tells us at great length about the ancients and what great faith is. So when we look at Hebrews chapter 11, what does it say? What does God say is great faith there? Well, in verse 1, so the start of the chapter, it sets the whole tone, and it says this: "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for." So it's hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Now, some might say, well, what I do not see is I see Andrew in a wheelchair. I do not see him walking. And so faith is the ability to see him, to picture him walking, and to somehow claim it and believe God for that. But that is not at all the context of what the writer is saying here. In fact, he would say, I would think he would say, if you see Andrew, if somehow you could miraculously have the faith to heal Andrew, it would in a sense cease to be faith. And the reason why it would cease to be faith is because you would see what you were hoping for. You would get it immediately. And so at that point, it no longer requires any kind of faith because things are happening immediately. And indeed, I think one of the things you can be very certain of, I've mentioned this before, one of the things that we are most fearful of and most dislike, I won't use the word hate, is to have to live by faith. And we do everything we possibly can to avoid living by faith. So we always like to have a plan B, and we do everything we can to live in a world of security, so that we would not have to live by faith, that we would not have to really trust. And so we have our bank accounts, we have our homes, and we don't like it when we get things like COVID-19, and they challenge our security and our safety, because that's what we want. And so there's a sense in which we want the miraculous, because if we could get that, then we, in a sense, don't have to trust God, because whenever I need money, I can just claim it and get it. Whenever I need health, I can just claim it and get it. Whenever COVID comes, I can just, speak it away. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because that's the picture of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Let me read on. All these people, these ancients, the people in the Old Testament who were living by faith, all of these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. They were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Now, Hebrews 11 is a long chapter, and I encourage you to read that chapter. I don't want you to think that, I'm just picking and choosing to prove my point. This is the message of the whole chapter, a lengthy chapter, right? Faith is not seeing what you're hoping for. Faith is not to claim miracles or to change this worldly environment by getting the miraculous so that I don't have to suffer, so I don't have to be of the world, nor in the world. Faith is looking forward to the world that is to come, to the city whose architect and builder is God. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. There will not be heaven on earth. And if we got every miracle we would like and pray for, we would essentially have what? Heaven on earth. That's what we would like, heaven on earth. It goes on. Now we go into chapter 12. Right? And he's dovetailing from 11 into 12, and he says, therefore, based on all I just said in chapter 11 about what faith is. Now, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, and the imagery here is as if you were running a race, which he'll say, and there are stands all around, and it's filled with people. Filled with those who've gone before, who have lived by faith, the ancients. Since we are surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Perseverance, race, hard, right? Not easy. What if I got all the miracles I wanted? No perseverance needed there. Because I'm just getting healed. I'm just getting delivered. I'm just getting all that I want. No perseverance is required. The implication is it's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard. Now, Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith. Oh, Wait, he was healing people. Was he getting everything he wanted? That's why he's the author and perfecter of our faith. No. Well, he goes on and says this. He's the author and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. The joy that was to come, not that he was experiencing. The joy set before him, scorning its shame, the life that he lived, difficult, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who claimed miracles and had a great and exciting ministry, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. No. What does it say? Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. One more question, and the third point, the third way to answer this question about, so why don't we have as many miracles today as they did in the book of Acts? Is to ask this question. Are miracles a means or an end? Are they a means or an end in themselves? This is very much. All of these things would be, if you were speaking to a non-Christian, because they asked you this question, why aren't there more miracles? All of these things would be, I think, very reasonable to them. But this would be one question is, do you see miracles as a means or an end? Now, I think most of the time, we think about miracles as an end. So we want miracles to alleviate our suffering. Oh, pray for Andrew. Pray that he would be able to walk. Pray that he would not have any pain in his legs. Pray that his suffering would end. And then next Sunday, Andrew comes walking in, leaping, and I'm healed, miraculously healed. And what would we say? Great, praise the Lord. We got what we were asking for. Let's move on to the next one. Maybe we could get something rolling here. That is so wonderful. We got it. You see? We see the miracles as ends in themselves. Now, when you look at the book of Acts, if you look at even just the 5 chapters that we've started with, where it also, there's other indications in there. Remember when the Spirit comes on Pentecost and they're able to speak in tongues and things. It's interesting that Peter, it always says that Peter saw this as an opportunity to preach and to teach. These miracles were never ends in themselves. The miracle of itself is not sufficient. I remember, not that this is a healing miracle, but I remember when I first became a Christian, and I had met a gentleman at work who was also a Christian, and he was back then what you would call a charismatic Christian, and there was a organization back then called Full Gospel Men's Business Committee, something like CBMC. Whatever, and it was like a Christian group of Christian businessmen, but it was charismatic group. And so he said, we're having a special dinner, and we're having a special speaker. And he said to me, would you go with me? Would you be a guest of mine? And I said, sure, be happy to do that. So we went as about maybe 200 people, kind of like in a cafeteria type of setting. And, I was a relatively new Christian, but I had read my Bible and thought about things somewhat. And so, but I wasn't really familiar with all this. This was my first charismatic experience. So this guy gets up and he starts leading this worship time with his guitar and stuff, and people, which I had not seen before, they had their hands up and they're swaying. It's all men, and they're swaying and stuff, and we sing some choruses and things, and then all of a sudden, this guy starts yelling, and I'm going like, what is going, He's yelling, and everybody else gets quiet. I can't, and he's just going, it sounded like this total babble to me. Whatever. And everybody's quiet. We're just listening to this guy who's yelling. And then he stops after, 30 seconds of this, And, you could just feel like there's this hush in the room, like, that was God. Oh my goodness, that was God. This is so powerful. And then we started singing choruses and stuff again, and then it's interesting, I'm going on too long with this story. Oh, but even as a new Christian, I thought, I don't think this is right. Because, even though I'm a new Christian, I remember that Paul said to the Corinthians, when they're speaking in tongues in a setting like this, there needs to be somebody to interpret that. Otherwise, there's no value to that. Speaking in an unknown language, when it's some kind of private, that seems like to indicate that Paul did, when you're alone by yourself is one thing, but when you're in a gathering, and if there's this manifestation of the Spirit, the speaking in tongues, there needs to be some interpretation. Otherwise, Paul says people think you're just crazy because nobody can understand it. So already I thought, nobody just didn't stop the service and say, well, brothers, somebody must have an interpretation of this. If God gave this man the gift of speaking in tongues, then he would give somebody some interpretation of this. And I was thinking at first, I'm pretty excited, he's going to give me the winning lottery numbers, or, a hot stock pick, or something to predict the future, something startling. But there was no interpretation, nothing. No interpretation. It was just an end in itself. Wow, that was cool. But you don't see that with Peter. They spoke in languages that the other people understood, first of all. I'm not saying that tongues doesn't exist or whatever. I'm just saying in that situation, I'm just explaining what happened and how it was an end in itself. And that's how we think about the miraculous often. It's an end in itself. I think we think, sometimes too, well, wait, no, it's not, if we could do miracles, just think how people would be converted. Because it seems like, even in Acts, as we read here, that because there were miraculous signs and wonders, that people were converted. Many came to believe. So, do you think that is the case? Do you think if you could do miracles, if Pat could go home and see her husband and say, we were, as a congregation, we're praying for you, Gary, and they spoke to me, and we agreed that God wants to miraculously heal you right now. And I am the bearer of that good news and God's instrument to you through our congregation. Be healed. And Gary gets up. Suddenly he lost 65 pounds. He starts dancing. His heart is healed. He's going to go for a long run. Now, don't you think Gary would become a Christian? Wouldn't you think that? Wouldn't you think if you could go into your family gathering on Thanksgiving and say to them, I'd like to just want to tell you I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus, and Jesus wants you to see that he's real. And so, Aunt Betty, you You lost your leg from the knee down in an accident 25 years ago. Check it out again. And she looks down and she has a leg. And I said, check this out. I'm going to make that turkey come off that plate and start gobbling around the room. Wow. Do you think people would come to Christ? Do you think they'd say, your God really is the God? It really is God. Like Elijah and the prophets. This kind of power encounter, that would do it? Well, if that's true, then you have a better plan than God does, I guess. I guess you're saying God is holding back some things that would lead to people becoming Christians, but he's decided, I'm not going to do that. Let them go to hell. He's not doing everything he can. But Peter says, God desires that all would be saved. And it just seems like if he did not spare his own son, but gave up his own son so that we might be saved, that God is doing everything possible for us to come to him. He's not trying to make it difficult. Why would he do that? That doesn't make sense to me. And if he knew that doing miracles on a broad base would bring people to him, don't you think he'd do that? Do you think if he believed that, if he knew that if he wrote in the sky, Jesus is Lord, or, spoken audible voices, that would do it? Is he just holding back? No. We think that would be the case, but for example, in Luke, first of all, we're going to see when we go on from here, everybody wasn't excited about the miracles they were doing. The Sadducees, the teachers of the law, and plenty other Jews wanted to kill these guys just like they killed Jesus. So don't say that just because a miracle happens, everybody's going to fall down on their knees and say Jesus is Lord. Also, Jesus, when he was talking about the rich man and Lazarus, if you remember that story, the rich man is in hell and he says to Abraham, let me go back and warn my brothers so that they don't come here. And what does Abraham say to them? He says to them, they have Moses and the prophets. If that is not enough, then even if somebody rose from the dead in front of them, they would not believe. Even if they saw a miracle, they would not believe. Jesus did plenty of miracles. And what did they say to him on the cross? Do another miracle. What did he say? They say to him, well, do another one and then we'll believe. If you're the Son of God, come down off that cross and then we'll believe. Do you really think that would have been the case? No. So what you see is it is a means, the miracles are a means to glorify God. They accredited Jesus, it says, even in Acts, Peter says, Jesus did miracles to accredit the message, not exclusive of the message, but to accredit him to fulfill the prophecies, to show that Jesus was the Messiah. The message is always given. The miracles are an opportunity for the message. People are not saved by belief in the miracle working power of God. People are not saved by the miracle working power of God. Just believing that God can do miracles doesn't save a person. It's through faith. It's through being born again, through faith in Jesus the Messiah. That's why there always has to be the preaching, the explain. How can faith come, Paul says in Romans 10? How can they believe unless they see miracles? No, unless they hear the message. We have to remember about incarnational love, right? Jesus suffered, became a man, humbled himself, right? Philippians 2. He suffered with us. He put on his pants, proverbial pants, one leg at a time. I'm sure as a carpenter, he hit his thumb more than once. He suffered with us. That's what the incarnation is, entering into that. If every Christian can do miracles on tap whenever they want, what happens? Then you're no longer in this world. There is no incarnational love. You're not suffering like the rest of people. We're different. We don't suffer. But Jesus did suffer. And we say and we know, again, right? There is great value to suffering. Suffering produces character. And character, hope, Paul says in Romans 5. We see that in James 1. Again and again, we'd all agree that. But still we want to get rid of all suffering. And if I could just have a miracle, I'd get rid of all suffering. You see? And with it would come, as Jesus said, leanness of soul. I mean, as it says in the Old Testament of the Israelites. So, okay, let's end this. So, all right, so Dave, what are you saying? How am I supposed to apply all that you just said to me? And this is what I would say. First of all, to me, it's a reminder of I want to live everything that God does, and that's what I want, is to live for the glory of God. That is the goal. Not me having a better life, an easier life, my best life now, or any of that stuff. I want to live and die and suffer or be miraculously healed for the glory of God. So God, please let that be true of me. If it is in Christ-like character, if it is in suffering long-term, if it is dying instantly, whatever it is, Lord, I am your servant. This life is short and passing. And I want it to count for glorifying you. I have nothing to lose and everything to gain. So I just find it so helpful again and again to remind myself, I live and die and suffer or am miraculously healed for the glory of God. Myself keeps telling me, live for comfort, live for ease, live to make yourself happy. And I have to keep reminding myself that, no, that is not true. That is not where the fullness of life is. That is not where eternal life is. That is not what God has called me to do. That is not what He has created me to do. He has created me for His glory. How should I vote in the upcoming election? I should vote for the glory of God. Should I go protest with other people? Will it glorify God? What should I do on Sunday morning? What will glorify God? What should I do this afternoon? How should I speak? What will glorify God? And as I said, if glorifying God is miraculous, doing miracles, then God, I want to do that. I want to glorify you. The second, live for the world to come. It just seems like a profound message in the early church. This world is not our home. Don't expect it to be. And that's the message in Hebrews 11, right? They were pilgrims and foreigners. And the great hope of the early church, which goes through considerable suffering, which we will see in the verses that follow this one, this passage, is their hope of the return of Jesus Christ and the end of it all, the world to come. Read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. That is the tenor, the tone. That is what it's all about in his message. Live for the kingdom to come. Live now in the kingdom for the kingdom to come. And then the last one is to long for the end of suffering. To long for the end of suffering. And what that means is this. When people are suffering, when Gary is suffering with a heart attack, when my wife is suffering with Parkinson's disease, when Andrew is suffering with muscular dystrophy, when your next door neighbor is dying of cancer, it's sad. And I pray that they would be healed. I pray for an end of suffering. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the heart God has given you. God desires an end to suffering. Well, what about praying for miracles? Should I pray for a miracle? I'd say pray as God leads you to pray. If God is leading you to claim a miracle or whatever, then pray that. He knows what's on your heart anyways. But for me, God has rarely, extremely rarely, I felt impressed upon me to say, I want to miraculously heal this person and you should pray that way. And my experience has been, maybe wrong, maybe lack of faith, maybe whatever, but my experience is 99.999% of the time, he is not going to miraculously heal. That is not his way. That is not his will. That is not for this world. Or that is for this world. That's the world I live in. So let me just be very frank there and say, so I think God, for some people who are constantly claiming for miracles and believing it, he says, I'm tired of hearing the whining. Hello. You're in this world, and in this world you will have trouble. You will have tribulation. There are exceptions. That's why we call them miracles. Why and how, God, I don't know. But to me, it seems like in a professional Christian who spends time with other pastors and we pray for people and healing or whatever, to me, it does not seem to me that it glorifies God when we are constantly claiming miracles that never happen, that God is not going to work. And that just kind of communicate to people that we want to make heaven on earth. We want to make everything better. All that really matters is physical healing and alleviating every little boo-boo or discomfort or something. That is, we know better than that. We know what matters is godly character. We know what matters is what glorifies God. We know that our hope is not in this world. It is in the world to come. So why don't we pray and act and live that way? I can be terribly sad about people suffering. I can pray, God, comfort them. And it seems appropriate to me to always be praying, like I did with this morning with Gary and the janitors. God, I feel bad that they're suffering. I don't like to see people suffering. That's how you've made us. I weep and mourn with those who mourn. But I also realize that what is most important for Gary is not to get through this latest disaster or just to reform his life physically, right? It's people's spiritual well-being. What does it profit a person to gain the whole world, to get the healing they want, to get past the latest disaster, and to lose their own soul? So shouldn't I be praying for that? And shouldn't I be careful I mean, as C.S. Lewis said, God's megaphone is what? Is suffering. God is often, that's when we're most receptive to him. But no, we want to pray for miracles to get people out of that. Maybe we're praying to keep people away from God.